Well, I think our takeaway from the budget forecast is that elections have consequences. And when Minnesotans switched control of the legislature to 100% Republican control, we went from a $1.6 billion surplus to a $188 million deficit in a little bit less than a year. So elections have consequences, and hopefully people will keep that in mind as we move towards 2018.
Well, I've been sounding a cautionary note for a while, going back to 2014, actually, when Governor Dayton wanted a federal conformity bill passed on tax policy, and we had just balanced the budget in the 2013 session after managing, but for 1 year, a decade of deficits. Having lived through that, I think Senator Cohn will reinforce that we're pretty sensitive about structural balance in the budget and are always concerned about things on the spending side or the tax side. So going back as far as 14, when we finally got it balanced, we did a tax bill in that conformity bill. It was probably too big that year. But Senator Scoy and I actually added a provision that made it more palatable for us, and that was the provision that's in law that says 1/3 of any surplus in November has to go to the budget reserve. I think we're still pretty proud of that provision. The bond houses talk about it. It is the money that's going to be there for us when we have the next economic downturn, and there will be one. I pretty strongly advised the governor the last night of the special session not to sign the tax bill because it wasn't sustainable. I guess I'm not happy about the fact that I was right. But you know, that $188 million doesn't include the funding for the legislature, so the number is actually up over $300 million. And I really hope we can find a way in this session to fix the problem not only in this biennium, but in the next one. Because I do think we have an obligation to the next legislature that comes in here after the 18 election and the next governor to hand them a balanced budget. You know, Governor Dayton didn't get that when he came in 2010. He inherited a mess. So I am absolutely willing to work bipartisanly to make sure that we can resolve this so that we hand off to the next governor and the next legislature after the 18 election a balanced budget so that they can put the next budget together based on what their more recent priorities are of the public.
You know, there's one thing that I would like to add. I refer to the November forecast historically as a benchmark. And this year in particular, that's important to keep in mind because the February forecast is going to be absolutely key. We have a whole lot of uncertainty with what's going on in Washington. The tax bill that they've now got in conference committee, and if that's resolved before the February forecast, we'll have a better understanding of where we will stand long term in the state of Minnesota. Most of you have written about or read about what some of those tax changes mean for a state like Minnesota and the impact on middle class taxpayers. And so that will also impact on the state budget depending on what comes out of that conference committee and what they ultimately pass.
I will resist, but probably not very well, saying I told you so. This is exactly what we spoke about at the end of the session. This is some of what we spoke about during the session. It's what I spoke about and wrote about during the summer. When you don't pay any attention to the greater context of the budget forecast, when you simply look at the number and see that number and don't pay attention to what's within that number, what it means in terms of the future economy, what it means in terms of the present economy, this is exactly what happens. And despite the disappointment relative to the number for the remainder of this biennium, when you look at the number for the next biennium and keep in mind that the budget that was passed this year was built upon significant parts of one-time money, that will only exacerbate where things are the next time around in a year and a half. And we talked about this during the session, that this budget was being put together in a haphazard way that didn't take into account the state's economy and where it was going, the fact that this is, I believe, the 9th year of economic expansion, the longest economic expansion in post-war. And when you take a look at those kinds of things, you're just simply not going to be able to maintain spending at the level that this legislature passed. And I realize that sounds a little bit counterintuitive to suggest that the Democrats might be more conservative relative to spending. But we certainly would not have used the budget reserve as a slush fund. We would not have used one-time money as was the case. And we would have looked at the context of the budget forecast in a more realistic way. And we would have also not left only $130 million on the bottom line for the next biennium. That was something absolutely calling for a budget deficit. And keep in mind, the budget deficit for the next biennium is significantly beyond that $130 million that was left on the bottom line. You could see that coming. It wouldn't have taken a genius to suggest that that's where we would have ended up today. I hope this next year's session will be able to work through some of this and, again, put together a budget that will be more sustainable. The governor wanted to veto the tax bill for being fiscally unsustainable. He was absolutely right. It was unsustainable. Many other parts of the budget were fiscally unsustainable, and that's where we are today.
Can you say definitively that it was the budget the legislature passed last year, not broader economic trends? I mean, is it fair to just say this is the Republican legislature's budget that caused these projected deficits?
Well, unemployment continues to go down. GDP growth has slipped some, but not significantly. My concern always was, and I think the concern of Senator Cohen was, this 2% GDP growth that we've got, it's not going to hold. And these numbers are going to get much worse down the road when the economy starts to slow down. And we don't know this federal tax bill, all the things that are in it, and I know there's people that are cheering about it for the business community. But, you know, the only thing we're really seeing so far relative to the business community is the statutory rate reduction, 35% to 20%. What else lies in that? Because most businesses, especially large businesses, don't pay a rate anywhere near to that. They have an effective tax rate that's built off of deductions and credits, just like they don't pay Minnesota's over 9% rate. Most larger businesses pay something in the rate of about 3%. So I think there's a huge question whether the economy is going to benefit from that tax bill, because I think we just don't know enough about what lies under just all the rate changes that are in it. So I think pinning your hopes to something that, and I certainly hope we see some economic expansion with it. I think it's more likely we'll see some inflationary increases from it because, you know, if you're at full employment, it's going to be pretty hard for people to add jobs. But I don't know enough about it yet to have a good opinion whether it's going to help or hurt Minnesota's budget. I know for the most part in this room, we've tried to be in conformity with federal tax changes that are made, and we're not in all areas. But there is no way that the state has the resources to get into federal conformity with this bill from the preliminary estimate that I saw. So we are going to deviate widely from where the federal government is at if the numbers I've seen about what conformity is going to cost happens. And the certified public accountants are going to go crazy because it'll be a real windfall for their industry as you try to figure out how you add things back, because we work off your federal adjusted income, how we add things back when you do your Minnesota returns. So there's some real problems, I think, on the horizon that the federal government is handing off to the states. And it's not just in the area of tax policy, although that is the thing kind of on the front burner today.
The governor suggested that this will require modest corrections if the track stays on the same way into February. You seem to be talking about a bigger repair job.
Well, I'm looking further down the road. I'm looking past this current biennium that we're in. I still plan to be here and help play some role in crafting a budget for the next biennium. And I don't want to be managing a deficit. There are things that we're going to want to invest in bipartisanly, Republicans and Democrats. And I went through a period of time, you know, during the plenty years where we went from deficit to deficit to deficit, and we couldn't even spend money that Democrats and Republicans agreed we should spend money on. And the perfect example was early childhood. When I came to the legislature, there was no committee, there was no funding. And, you know, we learned early in those plenty years that early childhood spending was a good investment with paid huge returns. But for a decade, we knew it, but we had no money to respond to it. So I don't want to see the next legislature or the legislature after I'm gone be in a position where they can't respond to what they know, everyone knows are good investments. And when you are managing from crisis to crisis to crisis, which is what we did during the plenty era, you can't make good decisions for the future of the state. So my view is a little bit longer. You know, the governor's, I guess it's not going to be his problem. He's not going to be here, but I do plan on being here and do care that the next budget is one that serves Minnesota well.
The governor did not blame the legislature. He said the legislature and I probably spent too much, essentially. That's a summary. And people up there are pointing and saying this is the product of a Republican legislature. That's different than what the governor said.
I didn't vote for all the bills. The governor signed them all. So maybe he's got more ownership in him than I do, I guess. But, you know, I was pretty clear that end of session, and most of you were there that last night. And there's a lot of good things in the tax bill that we passed last year. In fact, there's probably nothing in there that I didn't support. But you can't always get everything you want because there just aren't enough resources for it. And so I'm not critical of the tax committee for the bill that they put together. A lot of good provisions in there, but just a little bit too big, a little bit more than we could afford. I mean, a lot of people would like to have put more money into early childhood or more money into K-12. I would like to put more money into higher ed, but we just didn't have the resources to deliver on everybody's wants and needs. And that's one of the challenges of especially being in leadership when you have some money, when you have a surplus. And it's a neat thing about this state is people come here when you have some money, and guess what? Everybody's thing is the most important. And everybody wants a piece of the pie, and it's very hard for legislators to not overcommit. And that's just kind of what happened in the current biennium we're in here, is I think we overcommitted on the spending side. Maybe we spent too much in some of the budget bills also, in addition to the tax bill, but we overcommitted. And now, and historically, the only difference between the November forecast and the February one is the holiday shopping season. And that is kind of the correction that they make. How did the holiday shopping season come in compared to what they were forecasting in November it was going to? And that's kind of the only factor. So it normally doesn't change much. This year might be a little different. Once we learn more about the potential implications of the tax bill, maybe it'll have more impact on the February numbers than historically they have.
Can we hear from Leader Portman, too? You sound like you were ready for the campaign and saying Republicans brought you deficit. Sounds like are you going to use that for fodder to try and take back the legislature?
Well, we're seeing the same thing at the state level that we're seeing at the federal level, which is a massive wealth transfer from the middle class to the super rich. So we have Republicans at the state level and at the federal level cutting taxes for super, super rich people who don't need a tax cut, cutting taxes for corporations, and then leaving the middle class to hold the bag. So whether it's not funding the children's health insurance program and leaving that on the backs of the middle class, or other cuts that they might be looking at, I think that you can see Republican priorities are special interest donors, and Democratic priorities are the middle class. And fiscal responsibility, I would say, also.
Senator Buck, you just came from sexual harassment training, so both you and Leader Portman, is there enough transparency within the legislature about how sexual harassment is handled and dealt with, and what cases?
Well, let me first say it's very complicated. It's a different kind of work environment. It's a little bit, I kind of liken it because maybe I'm from the construction industry. It's kind of like the construction industry where you got a general contractor that's managing a project or a construction manager, and you got all these other people who aren't under your supervision that are in your workplace. And they're here every day, and they're not all just lobbyists. They're all kinds of other people that network around the building. So it's a different kind of work environment. It's hard for us to control things that are really out of our control, but to the extent we can make it a more respectful and a safer workplace for the people under our control, I'm committed to doing that. But I don't know, for example, with people of the press corps or lobbyists that are kind of daily attenders here, how we deal going forward with a reporting mechanism for other people that are interacting in our workplace virtually every day that we have no supervision over. So that, I think, is a larger conversation that, frankly, maybe we ought to involve some representatives of the press corps and some representatives from the lobbying community to make sure that the overall atmosphere of the Senate, much of or the legislature, much of which is out of our control, that we all learn something from the recent events and make the atmosphere better.
But does the public know enough about the accountability when these cases do get brought forward?
Well, I can't remember the last time we had one, so you know, I guess the most recent one in the Senate was the staffer and the majority leader in recent times, and that was a bit of a public process because there was a lawsuit, but you know, I think we're all still, probably trying to digest what all happened and try to be thoughtful in responding. But there is a reason that there isn't the level of transparency maybe that people might like to have, and I've heard the governor talk about it, that you know, all the legislature's documents and everything they do should be transparent to the public. I would argue some caution on that. I mean, the constituents contact us sometimes with very sensitive issues, things that are happening, and they probably don't want to be called out in the press for contacts maybe that they're making with their legislator trying to resolve a problem. So I think some of the data privacy provisions are important, that if people are going to get the kind of representation they want, their concerns for them to come forward and have them addressed, I think some level of discretion, I think, is important.
And I would say my biggest hope going into the 2018 session for real bipartisan work is on this issue. Clearly, we have figured out that there's a problem in the atmosphere in the country with regard to sexual harassment. And I think at the legislature, we really have 3 areas we need to look at. One, we need to make sure that members and staff understand the reporting mechanisms that we have and the process and the policies and the procedures in place to protect them. 2, we really have to create a mechanism so that a lobbyist or a member of the press or somebody who's not an employee of the House or the Senate has a forum within which they can make a complaint and get some sort of responsive action without feeling that they're putting their career in jeopardy. And then 3, I think we have to think about the rest of Minnesota. As we look at making our atmosphere more healthy, we have to look at the workplaces in the entire state of Minnesota and say, is there anything about our law that's inadequate to protect people in the workplace today?
Thank you all. Wish Senator Thomasoni a happy birthday when we see him.
Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say that listening to the governor and his message just an hour or so ago and hearing Myron Franz, both of them were conciliatory. Both of them had the idea or thought that we have to work towards this next session. I appreciate that they didn't feel like we were being blamed, but they just recognized that sometimes you're a little short or you're a little over. But frankly, both of them said that this is really something that is small in light of the overall picture, and frankly, as I looked at this budget forecast, it felt like it was obsolete on arrival. They're already talking about we have to look towards February, and I would agree with that. First of all, let me say I got good news and bad news. I'll give you the good news first. Our economy is booming. Unemployment is at near record lows. Job growth is way up. Consumer optimism is way up. GDP, last 2 quarters, 2 in a row, is well over 3%, which hits in that 20-year average of the past of 3.1%. Good news, good news, good news, good news, good news. The only bad news I have is that the forecast seems to project the worst, when I believe in a much better picture. And in that regard, we're just going to have to wait to February to see. But when you use GDP numbers of 2.2% when
it appears to be higher than that, every number looks bad. When you don't factor in the CHIP money that we're going to get, where it would almost be equal, that makes it look bad. And when you first have the federal tax relief in last February's forecast, but then you take it out of this one, again, it created a number that's a little lower than it needs to be. But I'm optimistic. I see everything around me. I see signs of good things happening, and I think we're going to see that in February. But regardless of that, we'll figure it out. But, you know, I'm not worried about where we're at. I feel like we're moving in a great direction. Thank you.
Well, I would agree. I think there's a lot of really good signs in this forecast. But I think it's over cautious, and I don't know that that's on purpose. I had been predicting that this administration, who basically controls the forecast process, would manipulate the numbers to show a deficit. I don't necessarily know that that's what's happened, but I do believe that this is overly cautious, and I think I agree with Senator Gazelka's assessment that this forecast is basically obsolete on arrival. It's forecasting economic growth at rates of 2.2% when current economic growth is the last two quarters 3.1% and 3.3%. So unfortunately, this forecast doesn't take into account the great economic environment that we have right now and that we've been seeing lately. And I think we'll look forward to the February forecast where we see that economic excitement. Now, I also think that historically the November forecasts have been a little more pessimistic, and the February forecasts have shown a little more growth from the November forecasts. I think we'll probably see that. The CHIP money, we have assurances from Congress that we will get reimbursed for that. That would basically make this a balanced forecast as opposed to a deficit. So I think there's a lot of factors that make this overly pessimistic, when I think there's a lot of reasons because of our economic growth currently that we're experiencing in this economy that we should be frankly very optimistic. So we'll look forward to a better economic forecast in the February forecast. I would agree with the governor and with the senators who spoke and said that we've frankly spent too much. Republicans have been battling that increased spending for years, and I think that in this forecast now you're starting to see those chickens coming home to roost. We can't see, when Democrats had complete control of state government, it was an 11% increase in state spending. This last biennium, as much as we battled the governor, we had to give in, and it was a 9% increase in spending. Now that also, they count the tax relief as spending, so it's a little bit of an artificial spending number, but certainly still the spending has been much too high in state government. For those that wonder if the tax relief had an impact on this, tax relief taken into account in this forecast, the revenue from the last biennium to this biennium, still $2.3 billion of growth in revenue. And from this biennium to the next, $3.2 billion in growth in revenue. So the revenue is not the problem here. The spending is the problem. And anybody who can read these basic numbers can come to that conclusion. I also think it's very interesting what we saw in the February forecast last February was an assumption that we'd have higher economic growth because the feds would pass a tax bill and provide tax relief, which would increase the economic growth in the country. About a month ago, the Council of Economic Advisors met and decided that they were going to remove that assumption. Now the assumption in this forecast is that no tax bill at the federal level will pass. So for those of you following along at home, when we don't pass tax relief, we don't see economic growth, and we lose revenue to the state. So we have less revenue now projected to come into the state because the federal government has not passed tax relief. These are really basic economic principles which we've been trying to explain to folks for years, but you can see them here very clearly in practice. Now, since that Council of Economic Advisors meeting a month ago, we see that it looks very likely that a tax bill at the federal level will pass, that tax relief will spur economic growth even beyond probably what we have right now. You saw what happened with the stock market today, and since they've passed the bills out of the House and Senate. That bill's in conference committee now, and it looks very likely that that bill will get signed into law. So I think that gives us a lot to be optimistic about, and I think when we see that economic growth that we're experiencing right now reflected in our numbers, we're going to have numbers that reflect a surplus, and frankly, we think that's a good thing. So if we can get our spending under control here in the state and reflect the economic growth that we're actually seeing in the economy right now, I think we've got really good things ahead for the state of Minnesota.
Well, I would say that my takeaway from this is actually pretty positive. When you look at when you dig into the book and you look at the numbers, it's an interesting snapshot. But if you look at what actually is happening in Minnesota in relation to the rest of the country, we've got the lowest unemployment in 17 years at 3.3%. That can be nothing but positive. We've got real GDP growth well above the nation. We've got Minnesota's annual job growth exceeds the U.S. average in 9 and 11 categories, and we've got wage growth that's going from 4.3 to 4.7%. So if you look at the book, all the categories, Minnesota is doing really, really well. And this doesn't even take into account of the tax relief that we passed this year, because these are 2016 numbers. It doesn't take into account of that or the infrastructure funding that we put into the economy. So I think the other main takeaway that both the other leaders have talked about is the fact that these numbers are not assuming the federal government doing anything. And once something happens to the federal government with the CHIP funding, it's really kind of a wash. So I think the main takeaway from this is that we're going to have to wait until February till we know what the actual numbers is. But the other main takeaway is that we're absolutely doing the right things in Minnesota. All of the numbers look great for what we're doing here. All the numbers are positive, and I think it's because of the great work that we've been doing here. So.
Great. Well, I first would like to thank the governor for recognizing that this forecast is very complex and that there's a great amount of uncertainty built into it. And I think the two leaders said it very, very well. We are dealing with an apples and oranges forecast from last February to this November as far as how it was measured. And I believe that is something that we have to really say, okay, we're going to wait till February to get the correct numbers. Minnesota is looking good. It's looking strong. It's looking healthy, and we are not in a downturn. So that is something to congratulate everybody, because it was a budget that was put by everybody together. And I think we need to say thank you to the governor and to the other side also for their hard work. With the federal tax bill and the CHIP funding, and then of course you've got till the end of the year, you've got the Christmas season, you've got bonuses, you've got the capital gains issue that could be taken before the end of the year. There's a lot of variables that we haven't addressed yet. And I just want to say something about we did spend a lot of money, and we had a 7.7% increase in K-12 spending and a 6.4% increase in higher ed to address some comments that were made previously. So we did pretty well on the spending, and just looking forward to some reforms and getting our budget in line and that February forecast. Thank you.
Well, I got to say something, huh? Well, I'll just reiterate really quickly. You would be looking at a surplus today if it wasn't for the CHIP funding, which the $178 million we expect will come through, and if it wasn't for the fact that in the February forecast there was an assumption that there was going to be a federal tax bill, and in this forecast there's an assumption that there will not be a federal tax bill, when it looks pretty clear like they're probably going to get something together at the federal level. But just that change in assumption between assuming there was going to be one in February and not assuming one now, and that $178 million of CHIP funding, that's the difference between having a projected deficit now and a surplus. So without those two things, or with those two changes, we'd be looking at a surplus today. And I think that it appears that things are going to come around to have a significantly better forecast than in February.
I can make one more comment, too, about our tax relief bill. It's been listed as $657 million of tax relief. Really, the tax relief was a lower number than that because it included local government aid, county program aid, still funding towards government. But we are very proud of the tax relief that we got for seniors and their Social Security income, Farmers and their property tax got relief. Small businesses and their property tax got relief. Those that had student loans, they get a $500 credit per year, first in the nation. So some really, really good things that we got done that we're proud of. And the spending, you know, I would agree with the speaker and the others that it was more than we wanted to spend, but that was our give to the governor. It was, if you look at real spending, real dollars, biennium to biennium, it was over $4 billion more increase. And that was the agreement that we all struck. But to say now that we should give up that tax relief, if anybody says that, it's just a real mistake. Those are real dollars that are getting into Minnesotans' hands that I think will greatly appreciate it. So, any questions?
How do you counter what you just heard from Democrats saying after 8 straight surpluses, Republican legislature brought you deficits?
Well, first of all, this is a forecast. It's not actual dollars. And then when you hear Commissioner Franz and the governor say, hey, this is a blip, this is not it's serious, but it's not really accurate yet. That's why we're all waiting until February. And you heard all of the different issues of why we think it's not accurate. I'm not worried about that. And in the end, you know, where we're going to be next year, I believe we're going to work together. Some of the key things that we have to pay attention to is the federal tax bill. What are we going to do about that? I'm hoping we have a surplus so that we can work towards that. But also HHS, what are we going to do if they give us less money? How are we going to address that issue? The pension bill we didn't solve. So there's a number of things we can solve and need to solve, and I appreciate the governor seems to be reaching out. Both the speaker and I are going to be working together and working with him. If the other folks that were up here before us don't, then we'll figure that out too.
You said it was overcautious and, quote, I don't know if that was on purpose. What are you getting at there?
Well, you know, I had been pretty vocal about making predictions that this governor and this administration has been more partisan and more political in the things that have traditionally in Minnesota been non-political and non-partisan, like our forecasts. So, you know, I had been predicting for quite some time that the forecast would be a deficit, and that deficit would be exactly equal to the 5 things that the governor wanted changed from his veto letter, right? I mean, it doesn't take a chess master to see what the governor's next move is. Whether that's what he's done here or not, I don't know. But obviously, the economic growth numbers that they have used do not reflect the environment that we're in right now. If we actually used those numbers, you would see a surplus today. You know, we've got economic growth the last 2 quarters, 3.1 and 3.3% growth at the federal level. That doesn't take into account yet the passage of a federal tax relief bill, which they say will spur economic growth even further. And, you know, we're projecting here 2.2% growth. So make of it what you will. I don't think anybody has stood here today and said that they believe that this forecast is really accurate. I think Senator Gazelka said it best when he said this is obsolete on arrival. Even just based on the fact that the federal tax bill looks very, imminent, the passage of that looks imminent now. This forecast is based on that not passing.
Are you saying that they purposely wanted a deficit to make a rhetorical point?
I don't know. I'll let you make that decision. I don't know if that's what they're doing or not, but I had predicted that a while ago. Go back and look for my comments from the past. I don't know whether they did it or not. I mean, I hope they didn't. I hope that things that remain nonpartisan and not political are forecasts. I hope this is based on sound information, but I think everyone, including the governor, has stood here today and told you that this doesn't reflect a very accurate forecast of where we are right now. So we're all talking about something that we all know isn't very factual, which is fine. It's the process that we go through, and the Council of Economic Advisors made their decision over a month ago that they didn't think a federal tax relief bill was going to pass. Now it looks like it will be passing shortly. That will change these numbers significantly, and we would see a surplus if they would upgrade the economic growth numbers.
So is it safe to say that none of you up here are rushing to drop a plan to correct this deficit on paper?
I think that everyone that spoke about the level of spending, and I think everyone has, is correct. I think the level of spending that we've had in state government has been excessive, and I don't think that it's sustainable. And I think that it has put us in this situation. You know, I know that some would, and I don't know that they did it today. I don't think anybody did it today, but in previous weeks and months, people have implied that because of tax relief, that we'll have a deficit. Well, you can see from the revenue growth numbers that we have, you know, $2.2 or $2.3 billion in additional revenue to this biennium, and $3.2 billion of additional revenue growth in the next biennium. That's even after we did the tax relief. So the revenue isn't the problem here. The spending is. And we need to take a longer term approach and view of our spending. And a lot of it is in HHS. There's been really excessive growth in our HHS budgets. A lot of that goes back to decisions that this governor made on his first day in office. And you know, ramifications of Obamacare. Those are things that we can't solve by ourselves. We need the federal government to help us and cut some strings so that we can put in place some Minnesota solutions. And we also need to do some things here in Minnesota to solve this together, Republicans and Democrats together, because we can't see that kind of HHS growth. Here, let's go here first and then I'll come.
Thank you. Along the same line, the governor said he believes that given the current economic climate, we've reached the limit of what we can do as far as investments, i.e. spending. Given the current economic climate, have we reached the limit on what we can do as far as tax cuts? I'm talking about Minnesota now, not federal.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. You know, I think that the example that we're seeing right now, where the federal government, you know, had they passed a tax relief bill in June or July of this year, we would have a surplus today. So if the federal government had reduced taxes, we would have seen economic growth that would have forecasted a surplus into our budget. So we know that tax cuts are good for the economy. Everyone, those are basic economic principles. If, you know, we certainly want to, you know, and if you look at our tax cuts, we gave, and as Senator Gazelka said, we gave money to seniors, to college students, to farmers. These are things that we thought would bring our tax code in the state of Minnesota into, you know, better competitive, you know, relationships with the states around us and with other states. We're losing a lot of revenue to other states. People can't afford to retire here. They can't afford to die here. And they move their wealth to other states. And frankly, the folks here in Minnesota that stay here still have to pay those bills. So we're seeing Minnesota's economy become less and less competitive because we're such a high tax state.
It sounds like what you're saying is that even with the federal cuts, which will help business overall in the nation, that we still need to do more work here in Minnesota, Mr. Speaker, Mr.
Yeah, well, the reason why I want to answer that, even before you ask that question, is if we get the federal tax bill, which we think we will have, there's going to be winners and losers, and we need to look, Minnesota being a high tax state, we have to relook at where are we taxing people, and if we do federal conformity or more of it, that is tax reduction. Well, the only way we're going to do it is if we have a surplus moving forward, or we reduce spending. That is never easy, but that's something that we always have to look at for our future. Does it make sense that we would reduce spending somewhere so that we could provide more tax relief so that we can conform to this new tax bill that likely will happen?
Well, it's interesting you say that because Senator Cohen said that, I think, if I'm not misquoting him, that doing conformity is just about, it's not possible to do federal conformity. It may be too expensive. One of the Democrats.
Well, Senator Bach said that, and he's on the, yeah.
It sounds like you disagree with that conformity is a key point in terms of adjusting the business climate in Minnesota, so it's more...
So Senator Bach talked about overall federal conformity. Both he and I serve on the tax committee still, and the point is it's typically difficult to do all of it, but you have to pay attention to what the federal tax laws are and helping Minnesota remain competitive with the rest of the states. And that's why I'm saying whatever the final bill is that passes, we need to take a good look at and say, is there something we have to do in Minnesota so that we remain competitive with the rest of the states?
Yeah. And, you know, I'd like to add to that as well regarding the federal tax reform, since we don't know which bill is going to be yet. There's a lot of information we don't know. And so all that stuff is going to have to be taken into consideration, and our staff is going to have to look into it. One example is the estate tax. What if the federal government does away with the estate tax? We rely on federal information to have that, so there's going to have to be certainly adjustments to all these things, the state and local tax deduction. There's going to have to be a lot of analysis to determine what this even means in our state going forward so that we can address the issues and make sure that we're being fiscally responsible in our state.
Assuming that CHIP funding comes through, tax bill passes Congress and that wipes out a deficit this biennium, is there still any cause for concern in the tails of, $500 million plus deficit?
Spending.
What was the,
Oh,
what was the question? What was the question?
Even if, the things that you're talking about with the CHIP bill and the tax bill are sorted out and that wipes out the deficit this biennium, is there still cause for concern?
Well, I think you couple it with the economic growth numbers. I think we're forecasting far too conservative of economic growth numbers moving forward. I just wanted to point out when I talk about the spending increases, interesting, if you look at just the one line item, medical assistance, it's a $2 billion increase in just that one line item. This all relates back to the decision that our governor made on his first day in office when he signed an executive order doing the early opt-in to Medicaid. And the chickens have come home to roost. We warned on that day that this was going to be a problem and the state couldn't afford that sort of action. We need to work together to get that spending under control, or this is going to continue to be a problem. And that's just literally one line item. It's a 19% increase. 19.5% increase just in that one line item, but that equates to, in our entire budget, that $2 billion increase, about a 5% increase in spending, general fund spending across the board in one line item. Equate that now to a less than $600 million tax relief bill, and I think you can see pretty clearly where the problem is. It's most certainly on the spending side.
Yeah, I guess I'd say, we have to see how the February forecast would look to really say what happens in the out biennium. Obviously, that's, going out up to 3 years from now, and so it's even more than 3 years. It's a little bit hard to predict, that far out what it will be like. I suspect, based on, the numbers I've seen, that if the federal tax bill passes, if we got the CHIP funding, that you'd see a big change in that number. But again, as the speaker was saying, we have some really big problems with spending increases here. Talking about medical assistance, that whole health and human services area is just gobbling up all the other money we've got for all sorts of other places that people might like to put money to, tax relief as well as other spending needs that some people would like to do. And so spending remains the real problem here that we have to get a handle on, and we've been trying to do that on the Republican side, but we will be continuing to work on that and hope the governor will work with us.
The question about working together to solve this issue, it seems like the tone from Senator Gazelka and the Speaker are a little different. In terms of more combative tone from you, sir, on just the kinds of figures that are being put out there, who's responsible. The governor had a more conciliatory tone, in my opinion. Are you able to work this out amongst the leadership?
Well, absolutely. I have never backed down from my commitment to work with everyone and anyone who wants to solve these problems, and we'll continue to do that. I understand people come to the microphone here and they want to put a little political spin on things. I was in the minority once myself and did that myself, and your job when you're in the minority is to get back to the majority, and I understand that there's reason to place blame or desire to. I'm not blaming the governor at all for the situation that we're in. What I'm saying is I agree with the governor. These numbers aren't accurate. I don't think anybody has stood here today and said that these numbers are an accurate representation of where we're at. I'm not blaming the governor that we have a deficit today. What I'm saying is I don't think we actually do have a deficit today because the numbers presented today are not accurate numbers. They don't reflect the economic environment that we're in right now. It's interesting that we're in this environment that moves so rapidly and fluidly that assumptions that were made 1 month ago now look completely antiquated. But the reality is we've had much higher economic growth in the last 2 quarters than what's predicted in this particular forecast. And I look forward, I'm optimistic, I look forward to a surplus in the February forecast, and I'm very confident there will be one. I think that will make our job a lot easier as we move into the next session. And I think the governor believes the same thing. So if you hear me blaming the governor, I hope that's not what you hear. That's certainly not my intent. But I do agree with the governor that that we have been spending too much money, and I agree with the Senate Democrats that said that as well. I believe that the spending increase has been too high. If you look at in the last two bienniums, I'm going to use two because we've only had one tax relief bill in two bienniums. The governor vetoed the one in the previous biennium. You look at tax relief versus spending increases, it's $12 of spending increase for every $1 of tax relief in those two bienniums. That's a big problem. And the fact is, even when we have $2.3 billion of revenue growth from last biennium to this and 3.2 from this to the next, spending is still outpacing that. $3.2 billion could get you 7% economic growth, but why are we predicting a deficit in the next biennium? We have additional revenue. There will be $3.2 billion of additional revenue next biennium, more than this biennium, but this forecast still predicts a deficit. It's very obvious where the problem is, right? It's not the revenue. The revenue will be there. The revenue would support a 6-7% increase in spending next biennium, but we still have a deficit forecasted. That's a problem.
I want to hit that. Esme, I want to talk about that a little bit. I think it's important. If you look at myself and the Speaker and the Governor, we have three different personalities, but we're all trying to help Minnesota. And the line item veto of the legislative branch put a shadow over everything else that we all did together. I mean, we talked about the tax relief bill. Maybe the governor didn't want it as high, but he still wanted the tax relief bill. But we passed a transportation bill, significant, biggest in almost a decade, all three of us working together to get that done. We passed at least $1 billion of increase for K-12 funding with two major education reforms. Again, it was all of us working together. We got Real ID done together. Sunday liquor, lots of people wanted that one done. But everywhere you turned, you found a working together, just something at the very end that overshadowed that. But if you look at actually what was accomplished by us working together, it's pretty great.
Gazelka, all House members will undergo new sexual harassment training ahead of next session under an agreement between the Speaker and the Minority Leader. The Minority Leader of the Senate says he plans to have all his members go through a refresher course between now and start of session. What's the plan for the Senate Republicans?
So before any of this came about, we had two December sessions. One was today, which is why Senator Bach was a little bit late. We have another one Thursday, and then we added another one for February to make sure that everybody is up to date on their training. Right away, I reviewed the policy in the Senate to make sure that are we doing what we should be doing. We've always required that people have it when they first come in, and then every 5 years after. The only thing that we didn't do that right now that I see that we want to do is that you don't get a pass by not getting it done every 5 years. And so, meaning they're supposed to have it after 5 years again, but if they don't have it done, we really didn't have a mechanism to say you're going to get it done. And we do have some plans there, but I haven't announced to senators on both sides of the aisle what we're going to do, but there'll be more. It's not okay to just not do it. And so, but as I looked at the process, I was glad that we had a good process in place from the start.
Will it be mandatory for all Republican senators to have a new course prior to session?
So for the legislators, they're elected officials, we can say you must take it. If they decide not to take it, we can't fire them, but there are other consequences that we can and will do. For staff, it's a different issue. If they don't take it, they're not going to work in the Senate.
And you heard me ask the others as well about the level of transparency around this. Are you comfortable with where things are at, transparency-wise?
Yeah, it's a fine line because I've been asked to release private information about where we're at. I can tell you, I'll say today that I asked for the last 10 years, has there been any official, where people have filed for sexual harassment in the Senate? There has not been. But it's a body that overturns or turns over quite a bit. I don't want to look back to the past. I want to look to where we're heading. I immediately asked for my side of the aisle, what does anybody know? I talked to some of the women on our side of the aisle just to say, are you hearing things that I'm not hearing? Because I'm very passionate about making sure that we're doing everything we can do to have a workplace that people feel comfortable in.
Do you want to tackle the transparency question?
Sure. I think that we've been fairly upfront with what has happened in the House. I can pretty much only talk about what has happened since I've been in charge of the House, but we have not had, the one complaint that you know about is the only sexual harassment complaint we've had against a member. We did have one staff-related one, but there was no member involved in it. It did not result in any lawsuit or anything like that. But we have had no payouts or settlements or anything like that in my time. In fact, there was some reporting that I read earlier today that said that there had been a sexual harassment complaint against a member of the legislature that happened back when I think Democrats were in control of the legislature. That was not reported. I did check with the Human Resources Department. That was not reported to them, which is our policy, which is alarming and concerning. And that's the second time now since we've started this process that I have learned that people who are mandatory reporters in the legislature have not reported to HR cases or instances of sexual harassment. That is going to be something that we are going to deal with in our policy to make sure that everyone is educated and they know if you have something brought to you that you need to deal with our internal policy and make sure that we're dealing with that in a way that frankly will get to the bottom of the problem, but also respect the legalities that can be involved in that process. So I have been very strong and very stern that we will have a zero tolerance policy in the House for sexual harassment. I think that everyone, whether they are employed here or whether they come here as the public or whether they work here either in the press or as a lobbyist, needs to feel that they are safe and respected in their workplace. And this workplace doesn't just mean that you are somebody that collects your paycheck from the state of Minnesota. There are a lot of other people that call this their workplace, and we're going to make sure that this environment shows them the respect that they deserve. So we will leave no stone unturned to make sure that our policies reflect the best effort that we can make to ensure that people do feel respected and protected here in the legislature. From the I don't know of any lawsuit. Oh, the defunding the legislature. I'm sorry, you're shifting. I was like, I don't believe that we have. I haven't seen that yet. Yeah, I have not seen it. I don't know if my staff has seen it, but I don't think we've seen it. So, all right, thanks everybody. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.